Coming up, a new era in China.
In China today, what we're seeing is people asking themselves, what do I want? What kind of world do I envision for myself and for my country? And then what am I going to do in order to achieve that?
New Yorker staff writer Evan Osnos discusses the rise of personal ambition, faith, and fortune in the Asian giant. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
We are delighted to welcome Evan Osnos to this Public Affairs Breakfast. Evan is a journalist admired by all, but especially by his peers, who commend him for his energetic, skilled, and thoughtful observations of those he met while living and working in China. Many of these individuals are vividly portrayed in this book, Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China.
I'd like to begin, if we can, by reading a little bit from the first page of Age of Ambition, and it'll set the context for our conversation today. Whenever a new idea sweeps across China, a new fashion, a philosophy, a way of life, the Chinese describe it as a fever. In the first years after the country opened to the world, people contracted Western business suit fever, and Jean-Paul Sartre fever, and private telephone fever. It was difficult to predict when or where a fever would ignite or what it would leave behind. In the village of Xiajia, population 1,564, there was a fever for the American cop show, Hunter, better known in China as expert detective Hung Te. When the show appeared on Chinese television in 1990, the villagers of Xiajia started to gather to watch Detective Sergeant Rick Hunter of the Los Angeles Police Department go undercover with his partner, Detective Dee Dee McCall. And the villagers of Xiajia came to expect that Detective Rick Hunter would always find at least 2 occasions to utter his trademark phrase, "Works for me." Though in Chinese he came across as a religious man because it was mistranslated as "whatever God wants." The fever passed from one person to the next, and it affected each in a different way. Some months later, when the police in Xiajia tried to search the home of a local farmer, the man told them to come back when they had a warrant, a word that he had learned from expert detective Hung Te. So why do I start a book on the subject of China today with a television show in a village? Well, when I moved to China in 2005, I was accustomed to reading about the place and thinking about the place in grand, broad strokes. You know, we often talked about it in terms of 1/5 of humanity and these great sweeping changes in politics and economics. If you move into a Chinese neighborhood, the things that you hear about and the things that people talk to you about are actually much more private dramas, intimate dramas, perceptual things, the things in their lives that actually shape the way that they imagine themselves as citizens and ultimately their place in the world. And that was the level of altitude from which I wanted to engage China from the beginning. I'm talking today about the age of ambition, and what that means is 2 things. I'm referring, obviously, in one sense to the ambition, the national ambition of a country that is feeling out a new, more muscular position in the world. But at the same time, I'm talking about another level of ambition, and that is the collective and individual aspirations of 1.4 billion Chinese people, who are, in their own ways, discovering the ability to aspire at all in a way that was never possible before. And my hope is that by looking at China in that way and framing a way of seeing China today, that it'll help us understand the kinds of choices that people are making, both in terms of how they orient their own politics and economics at home, and also, of course, how China is dealing with the rest of the world. When we talk about China today, I think it's useful just to remind ourselves where it's come from over the course of the last few decades. 20 years ago, 1994, was when I got interested in China. I wandered into a class on Chinese politics taught by Roderick McFarquhar, and it was an amazing story that opened up in front of me. It was a story with these incredible protean figures like Chairman Mao and Deng Xiaoping, and it was a story of civil war and of revolution, and all of it was compressed into 60 years. This was about modern Chinese politics, and it was operatic. And at the time, this was only 5 years after the demonstrations at Tiananmen Square in 1989. They, of course, ended in bloodshed, but in other ways, they also anticipated the period that was to come. When I look back on that period, I was, at the time, taken with the fact that these were young people, barely older than I was, who were very clearly torn between East and West. If you looked at these young people in Tiananmen Square in 1989, they had shag haircuts, they wore bell-bottoms, and they had these placards that said quotes from Patrick Henry. And yet they also sang the Internationale, the great communist hymn. And when it was time for them to deliver their demands, for instance, to the party leadership, they delivered them in the traditional style on their knees, delivering them to men who were buttoned up in their Mao suits. And so it was this pivot moment in Chinese life. And there was one quote that stays with me. This is a young student demonstrator who said to a journalist that spring, "I don't know exactly what we want, but we want more of it." I flew to Beijing in 1996 to start studying Chinese, and I have to admit, when I got there, it was not what I expected it to be. It was not the country I had imagined on the television. It was, in fact, as people who have been there, I think, can attest, it's closer in geography and spirit, really, Beijing is, to Mongolia than it is to Hong Kong. And in 1996, the country had an economy smaller than that of Italy at the time. And it smelled of old wool and coal and tobacco, and I loved it. I loved this sense that the place was just opening up around you. History was sort of unfolding, and people were taking risks in all kinds of new ways. It was not a particularly glamorous place. In 1996, the most luxurious destination in town was a hotel called the Jianhua Hotel, which the architect proudly described as a perfect replica of a Holiday Inn that he had seen in Palo Alto, California. China today is now home to 40% of the skyscrapers under construction worldwide. In the decades since then, China has been defined above all by growth, by plenty, by a sudden sense of what you can have that you had never had before. China today obviously does not want for food. The Chinese people eat 6 times as much meat today as they did in 1976. But they are also, in their own way, hungry for ideas and information and respect. And I think that points us to some of the issues we'll be talking about in a second on the international stage. When China began to move in this new direction, some of the questions that it had to answer for itself was, how do we accommodate our political system with an economic system we know we need to survive? And what they did was make a bargain with their people. They said, we will allow you to get rich if you allow us to stay in power. That was the bargain, and it wasn't complex, and it was explicit in many ways. And today, of course, China is the world's largest consumer of movies and beer and platinum and Louis Vuitton and energy, and you can go down the list. For some of its citizens, this has been the source of enormous fortune. For most people, it has not. But overall, the Chinese, by any measure, lead more educated, more prosperous lives than they ever have before. In 1978, to put it in perspective, the average Chinese income was $200 a year, and today it's about $6,000 a year. So who is running this country, and what do they aspire to? What is their ambition, if we want to understand China's place in the world today? In November of 2012, I went to watch the unveiling of the new generation of leadership. Whenever a new generation comes to power in China, it's a moment of great political theater. And on one afternoon, the senior ranks of the Communist Party gathered together in order to unveil the members of the Standing Committee and the new president, Xi Jinping, and the new premier, Li Keqiang. And the event, it was billed at the time as a meet the press opportunity, though it was not an opportunity for the press to ask questions, was choreographed down to the last detail. It was, as always, inside the Great Hall of the People next to Tiananmen Square. It was, as always, on the same stage in front of this great tableau of the Great Wall in autumn. And the image that was intended for the audience was very clear. It was about consistency. It was about the absence of division within the leadership. They wanted people to feel that this was business as usual in every way, as it had always been before. So when the leaders walked out on stage, the first thing that you saw was conformity. They were dressed in almost identical blue suits, with the exception of one of them. They were all wearing red ties. Their hair was dyed to the same shade of black in many cases. And the point was that they wanted people to feel that this was in the hands of a group that had reached a consensus. President Xi Jinping, the new president, steps forward, and he's a very interesting presence. Physically, he's very interesting, compared to his predecessor, for instance, who was almost by design a sort of forgettable figure. Hu Jintao had been selected by a group, and it was designed, he was selected in part because they had had enough of the cult of personality after Mao, and the point was to have people that would not attract that kind of following. Xi Jinping is a very different person. He is physically large. He commands the stage well. He's confident. He moves around very comfortably. He has a sort of Jackie Gleason quality about him, if you've ever seen him speaking in public. And when he stepped forward, what he said was fascinating. He didn't use any of the old party language, any of the sort of esoteric Latin of Chinese Communist Party language about harmonious development or Mao Zedong Marxist-Leninist thought. What he said was that he would dedicate himself above all to what he called the great renewal of the Chinese nation. That, he said, is the Chinese dream. And he repeated it over and over in the weeks ahead, and it became almost overnight a kind of the new slogan for the government, the new central animating idea. At one point we counted it up and it appeared on the front page of the People's Daily 24 times in 1 week. So what is the Chinese dream? What is it that he's talking about? Well, he's talking about a return to the way that the Chinese imagine their own place in the world. You know, after all, they see themselves as a great civilization, as they have been for most of human history, and they recall the days when they were printing 400 years before Gutenberg. You know, this is a civilization that had 1/3 of the world's wealth in the 18th century. And they say that is the position we should be going back to. And so when he talks about the great renewal of the Chinese nation, it's quite a sophisticated way of talking about his own past and, of course, also their future. In China, you see this kind of national ambition all over the place. If you've been there, you see that they're building more high-speed railway than the rest of the world combined last year, and they're talking about a mission to the bottom of the sea. It now loans more money to the rest of the developing world than does the World Bank. But this growing role for China has also, of course, put it into confrontation with its neighbors. And this is a period of immense, immense tension in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Part of this is because this has been a moment of change in the philosophy and the doctrine of foreign policy in China. For most of the last 40 years, Deng Xiaoping ordained an idea of the way that China would conduct itself in the world. And he called it hide your strength and bide your time, by which he meant allow China to grow, to continue to rejoin the community of nations, and then eventually, and all the while not upsetting the status quo, most of all, not upsetting the United States. But in recent years, China has become less comfortable biding its time and hiding its strength. It feels as if it has now reached a point in which it deserves to be regarded as a great power, and it wants to be regarded as a great power. At a minimum, what it wants is for the existing international system, and particularly the United States, to make room for China's interests in the world. That's the argument that it makes. I think for some of us in the United States, for Americans, it's easy to imagine, particularly at this moment when we feel a sense of vulnerability economically and perhaps with our role in the world, it's easy to imagine that China is setting out to supplant us at this point, to reshape the international order in a way that would make them the preeminent power. I think there are reasons to be cautious about that. I think if you talk to people in Chinese political circles, what they talk to you about are the immense domestic challenges that they're confronting, whether you're talking about corruption or environmental pollution or the opportunity gap that they're trying to close. The things that are foremost in their mind these days are about maintaining enough stability at home to be able to conduct their affairs and maintain power. They also recognize that being the preeminent power in the world, as much as they might have the ambition to be that eventually, comes with enormous costs. You have to police international sea lanes. You have to be responsible for taking in refugees. You're expected to do things that China doesn't want to do at this stage in its development. This is one of the reasons why when you saw the news that they had been described by one measurement at the World Bank as being now the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power, you would think, well, they would trumpet this news and put it on the front page of the paper. In fact, they didn't. It was not on the front page at all, and they disputed it. They said, well, we think the science is a little off. And the reason was that it turns out that when you're number one, people ask a lot of you, and they don't necessarily want to be number one at this point. I think the best way to imagine China's image for its place in the world in the years ahead is that it wants to see itself as a big power once again in a multipolar world. So it imagines that the United States will not occupy exactly the same position it's had for most of the last 40 years, and it doesn't want to take that position immediately, but it wants to be treated in some ways as a more significant player. So the question, if we now understand a bit about what Xi Jinping's China dream is, the question is how much does that China dream, how much is that shared actually by the people on the ground, the 1.4 billion people who are the engine behind China's enormous growth, and I would also argue perhaps the greatest source of political uncertainty in the years ahead. answering that means getting into what it is that actually drives people, what it is that they talk about, what makes them tick. I think it's useful to remember, by the way, that individual aspirations, the idea that you could define for yourself what mattered, is not a subject that actually got much attention in Chinese history. There really wasn't much room in the Chinese cosmology for individual aspirations at all. People's lives were embedded. They were understood to be part of broader forces, whether it was the family or the village or the factory or the military unit, and then ultimately the country. You were a part of a network of ideas and people that defined who you were. In fact, if you look at Chinese art, for instance, what you find in ancient Chinese art is that the individual figures are these tiny figures who are moving through mountains. They are part of this broader context. And then if you look at the equivalent in the West, the Mona Lisa is a full-frame portrait in which it's one person at the center of the narrative. Historically, even the word ambition had a negative connotation. In Chinese, the term is ye xin, which means literally wild heart. And to be accused of having a wild heart in Chinese was a terrible thing. It could ruin your career. It could get your family into trouble. What it meant was that you were sort of wolfishly ambitious, that you were putting yourself ahead of the group and putting yourself ahead of others. For most of Chinese history, the pressure to conform was the dominant fact of life. And this reached, obviously, its most dramatic illustration during the Cultural Revolution. There was a doctor whose work I've read who suffered terribly during the Cultural Revolution. He was sent out to the far western reaches of the country. His wife committed suicide. And later he was interviewed about the experience of what he had learned. He'd been accused of being a rightist, of being politically unreliable, for speaking out and for criticizing some of the things that happened. And he explained it this way. He said that to survive in China, you must reveal nothing to others, or it can be used against you. Let your public self be like rice in a dinner, bland and inconspicuous. If you want to go back and look at the moment when it began to change, it was 1978. This was the moment when the government embarked on this economic reimagination of what the country could be. In effect, what they said was, we're going to set aside our socialist scripture, and we're going to hold on to the saints, Chairman Mao, whose portrait still hangs above Tiananmen Square, and we're going to hold on to the things that define us as a political entity, but not as an economic organization. When you talk to people in Chinese about that moment, 1978, 1979, when they began, for instance, to break apart the collective farms and the factories, sending people out to go make a living for themselves, the word that they use in Chinese is songbang, which is a verb that is used for the unshackling of a prisoner or an animal. This is the word that they use themselves. So it was that profound as a change in the way that they imagined themselves as individual citizens. You began to hear it in the language. Even that word, the old word ambition, ye xin, wild heart, has changed. And if you go on to the Chinese internet today, if you go to Amazon.cn and you look up what's available on the subject of ambition, you'll find that the self-help offerings are all about ambition today. You can buy a book called How to Have a Wild Heart in Your 20s. Or my personal favorite is in the parenting section, Molding Wild Character, Nurturing a Child to Have an Untamable Personality and Wild Ambition. Even in rural areas where things tend to change more slowly, it's easy for us to imagine that these kinds of changes are just happening in the city. In fact, if you go off into the countryside, there's a school, for instance, in the Yangtze River Delta, where the students recite the following pledge. Ever since God created all things on earth, there has not been one person like me. My eyes and my ears, my brain and my soul, all are exceptional. Nobody speaks or behaves like me, no one before me, and no one will after me. I am the biggest miracle of nature. So in China today, what we're seeing is people asking themselves, what do I want? What kind of world do I envision for myself and for my country, and then what am I going to do in order to achieve that? One of the reflections of this is the ways that this has altered the traditions around love and marriage. It's one of the things that people don't talk about very much in public life in China, but has an enormous impact on the way they see themselves. To put it in context, in history in China, there wasn't really much room for desire and for individual choice when it came to marriage. You were basically paired off by the village matchmaker on the basis of whether your two families were a good fit. Later it was the cadre, perhaps, in the local party committee, or it might have been the lieutenant in your military unit who said, you two are perfect for each other, congratulations. There was very little room for the bride and groom. Today, that has changed quite dramatically. And people now have the right, in effect, to choose who it is that they want to marry. Their parents still play a role. Some things are, I would say, universal, but they now have the ability to make those kinds of choices in ways that they haven't ever before, and they've embraced that power of choice. I'm going to read you an online personals ad by a young woman named Lin Yu, who's a graduate student in the city of Wuhan. She placed an ad in the newspaper seeking a young man with the following qualities: no previous marriages, master's degree or more, not an only child, no smokers, no alcoholics, no gamblers, not from Wuhan. Taller than 172 centimeters, ready for at least 1 year of dating before marriage, sporty, parents who are still together, annual salary over 50,000 yuan, age between 26 and 32, willing to guarantee eating 4 dinners at home each week, track record of at least 2 ex-girlfriends but no more than 4, no Virgos, no Capricorns. As I've tracked over the last few years the awakening of these individual aspirations and desires, I've come to see it as occupying 3 baskets, 3 kinds of desires, 3 kinds of aspirations. And in effect, these are the engines that are propelling China through history at this moment. They are the pursuit of fortune, the pursuit of truth, and the pursuit of faith. And I'll explain briefly what I mean. The pursuit of fortune is exactly what it sounds like. It's the thing that we know most about China. This is the point when, in 1979, people had the ability to go out and pursue prosperity for the first time. But what's interesting is that the more that they acquired in terms of their physical assets, the more property they acquired, the more they realized that there were threats to that property, the more they realized they could no longer afford to be uninformed. You had to know who was setting the rules, how was policy being made, who was breaking the rules, who was benefiting. And that has created this surge of investigative instincts in China over the course of the last 20 years. And you see it in some cases in sort of independent media, and in other cases, of course, it's flourishing on the web. As people began to answer some of those questions for themselves, questions about simply how their society was organized, then they began to get into the deeper questions. And this is where you get to this pursuit of faith. They began to ask the existential questions. What am I here for? You know, what are my responsibilities as a citizen to my neighbor, to my country, to my family? What role does Confucius play in my life, for instance? That is if you talk to people today in China, I'm struck by the fact that 5 years ago, you'd sit down at a dinner table with Chinese friends and the conversation would be about real estate. Some things are indeed universal. And then it seemed to shift, and the conversation became about travel. It was about where you'd been and where you were going. And now the conversation is, who is your guru? And everybody is sort of in the search for some kind of satisfying spiritual solution. And that's been quite striking to watch. Very briefly, I'm just going to end by talking a little bit about a young man who I write about in this book, who is not somebody that anybody's really ever heard of, and he's not the most famous person that I write about it, but in many ways he's the one who I perhaps learned the most from. And he's a young English teacher. His name is Zhang Zhiming, and he's the son of a coal miner from Guangdong province. When I met him, he had been a security guard working on the edge of a kind of English language camp. This was this place where people go to learn English. And for the Chinese young people today, English is much more than a language or a skill. It is like a faith. Because what you believe is that if you can master English, it'll catapult you out of your existing station and into something else. And they're not wrong. I mean, it really does open up enormous opportunity. So Zhang Zhiming, or Michael as he called himself, had decided that English was going to be the secret for him. And he began to study it constantly. It really sort of became an obsession for him. And I went down and I spent time with his family and with his parents. And eventually he went out on his own. This was his own pursuit of fortune, was that he was going to start an English language training company. And he did, and it was called Beautiful Sound English. This was January of 2009. And I'll read you a little bit from the book about what happened to Michael. The quality of Michael's English always startled me. For someone who had never left China, he was clear and articulate, and he made relatively few mistakes in conversation and in writing, largely because there was almost nothing he wouldn't do in the name of improvement. When a music teacher suggested he hone his pronunciation by holding up a mirror and making exaggerated movements of his mouth, he did that, even on the bus. Right, he attracted some strange looks. When another teacher told him to shout, even louder than his hero, who's a Chinese English teacher named Li Yang, whose system of teaching English is that if you shout English at the top of your lungs, that it makes you less inhibited. He met somebody who said, your problem is you're not shouting loudly enough. And so he began shouting even louder. And he said to me, I didn't obtain my goal. All I obtained was chronic pharyngitis, and a doctor had to prescribe inhalation treatments to repair the damage. Most of all, though, Michael scoured the internet looking to find English recordings that appealed to him. And he recited them over and over to hone his accent. He read me one of his favorites. Something amazing is happening at Verizon Wireless that will change the way America talks. Something big, something bold, something new. Listening to him, I realized there was a universal quality to the sound of salesmanship, even if you didn't really care what it was you were selling. He continued, introducing nationwide unlimited talk from Verizon Wireless, now $30 less than ever before. For Michael, the study of English was about much, much more than even the possibility of improving your economic station. He framed it in his writings for his own students as a matter of moral entitlement. He wrote, you are the master of your destiny. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be different in this world. I'll just leave it there and say thank you again all for coming this morning.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.